net worth divorce with sort of gray divorce and people getting married later in life. Sometimes divorce is estate planning by other means. And that's the same for prenuptial agreements.
Welcome back. And today we're going to be talking about high net worth divorces. Now, these high net worth divorces, just like the rest of us, rich people get divorced too. So today we are talking about, if you are a high net worth individual, this would be a great video for you to watch so you can realize what would be the differences. Maybe you're not a high net worth individual, but you're curious what the differences are. Today I have Mike Day with us. He is an attorney that deals with specifically a lot of high net worth cases. So we brought him on today to help us unpack some of this. And we're going to get into maybe some of the strategies and the different things that they need to deal with when you are talking about just when you have a lot of assets and things that play out differently in court and how the attorneys view things. So welcome back, Mike.
Thank you for having me, Scotty. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and so today, I think if we stick around to the end, Mike's going to share some great inside tips to help you protect your assets if you are going through a high net worth divorce, and help you avoid some of the pitfalls he has seen. So whether you have luxury homes or businesses or assets that you don't want to get taken away, maybe this will be a really great video for you. So Mike, let's just start off with what is the definition of like a high net worth divorce? Like, are we talking about like anything over, is there a certain dollar amount here, or can it just be anything? Is there a classification for that, or?
There's not a classification. It's really sort of a general concept, I'd say. When I think of it as, divorces where the estates are in 7 or low 8 figures. And then once you get north of that, then that becomes ultra high net worth. And so sometimes you'll have different issues, in particular with the ultra high net worth. Those folks have, it could run the gamut from more domestic asset protection trusts, which are trusts situs in South Dakota, Nevada, Delaware, that sort of thing. Or maybe they have a lot more collectibles. Watches are a great example. Whereas your high net worth divorce, you're dealing with, and in both categories, if you have a closely held concern, you're going to have interesting valuation issues there. To the extent people have assets, in particular real estate outside of the territorial limits of Texas, that can always add a very interesting wrinkle. And then, they're not high net worth by definition, but sometimes you'll have cases where people make a lot of money and made a lot of money, but didn't necessarily save a lot of money, or people are getting married and divorced earlier in life. And so you have one spouse who's a high earner, and you have certain things like private school tuition, a very nice house, but you don't have the wealth. It's all income. And so, those divorces in some respects are much harder, and they're different in terms of the issues you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think it's, so there's obviously a big gambit of like what that range could be. It could be people that are millionaires or people that are, close to billionaires almost, right? And so the idea that, either way, these cases affect people. We've seen Bill Gates get divorced. We've seen other high net worth, Jeff Bezos got divorced, right? In those cases, they're billionaires with stocks and stuff like that, but they have to go through the same process of dividing assets and figuring out whose is going to be what, no matter what. So that kind of part's going to be at least probably the same, right? Like, how are we divvying this up? How long have they been married? Might play a role in that, right? But so like, what is there like an approach to dividing those assets, like our luxury home? Because we deal with a lot of real estate. We deal with, like, are we going to be selling that home? Are we going to be buying out that spouse? And so the equity in there, is there any different approach that you take on a, say, like a, $10 million home versus a, $500,000 home that you've seen personally?
Well, I don't know that it's values per se, but it's been my experience that if somebody has out-of-state trophy real estate, that becomes a lot more emotionally charged. And sometimes people's egos are so built into the fact that, oh, I have a place in California or Colorado, that it can actually make it harder than it has to be, right? Especially if that real estate was purchased 15, 20 years ago. Because if the property has to get sold, then you're not going to be able to buy a house in Carmel. Steamboat's a great example. Values in Steamboat in the last 20 years, really last 5 to 7 years, have gone up enormously, right?
Mhm.
And so that's part of it. The other thing I would say is that not all the time, but often enough, people, if they have real estate that's outside of Texas, those will be that house will be standing in the name of an LLC that's incorporated in Colorado, for example, right? And so then you're bringing in the corporate law of another jurisdiction that will really kind of govern what happens to that house, right? Because, and the way that works in a Texas divorce is that the LLC interest is personal property and it's subject to characterization, separate, community, maybe a little bit of both. It really just kind of depends. But it's not necessarily, and the real estate itself is not subject to division because it's a corporate asset. It is the treatment of the membership interests in that LLC, right? And so, does that make sense, Scotty?
Yeah, so like depending on it, because when we're dealing with real estate out of the state of Texas, like you're having a lawsuit in Texas or in the state of Texas, so like dealing with that, you have to treat it differently than you would treat if it was a home you own. If you own a home that's say high net worth home here in Houston, it's going to be treated differently than if you and it's whether it's in a LLC's name in a different state versus being here your personal it's held in both husband and wife's title, right? So how it's held and in the location is going to play into how you're dealing with it, right?
That's exactly right. And the other thing I would say is that if you have any kind of meaningful title, just let's say it's, well, I suppose regardless of whether or not the entity standing, the real estate standing in the name of an entity or not, if you have any kind of meaningful title dispute, then, and I'm going back to law school final exam territory, but that's sort of the distinction between what's called in rem jurisdiction, which is the ability to affect title directly, versus quasi in rem. So, for example, you and Amber have a house in and so then the question's like, well, I can't affect title directly if I'm a Texas judge, because that's beyond the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. But I can order Amber and Scotty to do things personally. But if there's another person, let's say the property is standing in the name of somebody's aunt who is a Mexican national, well, then, you're going to have a title dispute potentially. And depending upon the composition of the estate, that stateside, that could introduce a real interesting wrinkle. And the other thing too, and this goes back to the whole devil is in the details thing, is that, there was a recent case out of Dallas where these folks had condos in Puerto Vallarta, okay? And one person was supposed to sign over quote unquote deeds, okay? And if they didn't do it, then they had a liquidated damages provision, which is a stipulated damages amount of $600,000. There's a jury verdict where the person's like, oh, you didn't sign the deeds, $600,000. But it goes up on appeal, and the Court of Appeals reverses. And they reverse because it wasn't a deed that was presented. It was a different type of instrument, right? Because in some countries you have land leases, right? They're not technically, you don't own it, or and I don't mean to get into all the machinations of that, but it's really interesting. You want to be clear, like, so go back to the Colorado example. You would want to have the other spouse, do what needs to be done per the terms of that LLC operating agreement. If you are talking about real estate that foreigners cannot own directly, that they have to lease, maybe you have a different closing document that needs to get signed, so, and you're just going to have issues. And I've seen this happen a handful of times where you do have a title dispute as to who owns the real estate in a foreign country. And, to the extent that you have third parties involved that have not set foot in America, that creates a whole new ball of wax.
Yeah, so obviously those cases when you have foreign real estate, it's going to make it even more complicated and something you got to further impact. You might have to employ or get someone else that does know something about that while you're helping work with the attorney over here to deal with, like, so you have to get more people involved, which gets more costly and more expensive, right, when bringing other experts in to make sure, because if you are in a high net worth divorce, there's more likely that you could make mistakes. Like that sounds like a $600,000 mistake right there. That just like, oopsie daisy, right? So I think that's where you need the experts even more to know what they're doing versus just I can just have the guy down the street do this. So I think that's one of the biggest distinctions is like when you have more assets, you have more to lose, right? So the idea that we need to make sure we hire competent individuals. One of the things that I think is interesting about some of the high net worth individuals is prenups, right? And we've seen some of those, depending on how they're written, maybe they stood up, maybe they didn't, depending on what happens in there. In some famous cases too, like you get maybe so much more money for each year you stay married, right? And so the idea, like once you get past a certain point. So what is your take on prenups, and would you suggest them, even if, it's like, if you are a high net worth individual before planning for marriage, and then obviously what pitfalls have you seen with prenups?
Yeah. So for starters, prenuptial agreements, especially if someone has a meaningful separate estate, are not a bad idea. They're not a bad idea at all. I think if you have any kind of intergenerational wealth transfer, or anticipated wealth transfer, that's also not a bad idea. In terms of sort of issues that people have with them, well, if you sign one, I would not bank on the notion that you can just get it set aside. Getting a prenuptial agreement set aside is very difficult in the state of Texas. Let me put it that way. It's extraordinarily difficult. It happens, but it's very, very, very rare. And so sometimes what people will do is they'll get creative and be like, oh, I'm not setting aside the prenuptial agreement, I'm rescinding it. It's as if it never happened. Well, normally people have these sorts of very draconian contest provisions, right? Where it can become quite problematic for the person that loses that argument. And there was a case from the Texas Supreme Court within the last 10 years where somebody was like, I'm construing this or I'm rescinding it in the alternative or whatever the case may be. I'm not attacking it, but it was effectively an attack. And it's very problematic for the person who lost. The other thing I'll say is that you have to be very, very, very careful about if you think you're going to have anything kid related in the prenuptial agreement, because that is not the same as the property arrangements that can be made. Okay. And so one of the things that you also have to be mindful of is if you enter into a prenuptial agreement and then you have children later, right? A lot of times what people will do is the person that benefited from having the prenuptial agreement was like, aha, you don't get anything. It's all my separate property. And the other person's like, well, if you want XYZ type of relief related to the children, you're going to have to make some financial concessions. And then people will get upset and be like, well, I have this prenuptial agreement. And it's like, well, if you're looking for relief that the court is not inclined to grant you for whatever reason, then you're going to have to consider making some financial concessions, right?
Mm.
And I have seen that play out. And then, the thing about kid related stuff is that as a practical matter, it is always subject to being changed in the future. There's certainly always the risk of someone filing a modification. So if someone's like, well, I gave this person X amount of dollars the last modification they filed. What do you mean this person wants more? This is greedy. This is selfish. This is unreasonable. All three of those things might be true. But again, if it is relief that you're going to have a hard time getting in the family court for whatever reason, right? And there could be any number of reasons why that might be the case. It's just something to be mindful.
Yeah. So like obviously, we have a prenup about the property, about hey, this property and this property, but now we got kids together, and it's like, hey, that doesn't count. We can't cover children in that discussion because they're actually people, right? They're their own entities. You can't just say, well, they don't get extra money because we have kids together now, right?
Right. Well, I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, prenups can affect child support, right? So, they can affect child support. They can't affect other things regarding children as a concept of public policy. I mean, for example, someone's going to say, "Well, I want this. We're going to agree to raise our children with a certain religion." I mean, you can enter into that agreement, but it's a separate question altogether about whether or not it's enforceable. Someone says, "You know what? I don't want to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or whatever the case may be," right? And there are some cases on record that say that, compelling someone to stay in a religion or to require a child to be raised in a particular religious background as because it is a prenuptial agreement. I mean, there are cases that say that you can't do that. And then sometimes in the last couple of years, a very interesting case came out of the Texas Supreme Court that said it was the prenuptial agreement was going to be governed by Islamic law, right? And so, well, no, I mean, look, there are a couple of cases because what happens is you have this thing in Muslim households called I'm going to mispronounce it. I think it's called a talaq,
Okay.
talaq, one of the two. It's I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then so that dissolves the marital relationship. And there are cases where people lived in, say, Pakistan, and that's what happened. And then they come over to America and they say, look, we still need to divide the estate, but the marriage is over with, right? And so, and that could have any number of collateral consequences. It could impact immigration issues. It could impact custody issues if the person has restrictions on coming back into the United States. And so it's very interesting. And so, and then in fact, there's a new rule, 308B, because of those cases that says that if someone's going to start enforcing the foreign law, then you have to satisfy these other standards. And what was interesting about the Texas Supreme Court case interpreting Islamic law is that it didn't interpret Islamic law, right? Let's be real clear about that. But it expressly stated, we do not opine as to whether or not Islamic law is foreign law for purposes of 308B, because foreign implies it's a different country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really interesting,
Probably could do another whole video just on that, breaking down that case, right? I mean,
right. But to go back to the high net worth concept. So a couple of years ago, there was an appellate case where there was a private jet accident and husband and wife died. And there was a prenuptial agreement. And the prenuptial agreement had an arbitration provision. And the arbitration provision said that we have to go to, if there's going to be a dispute about construing this document, you got to go to arbitration. And what's interesting is, and I don't know off the top of my head the estates code provisions regarding arbitration, but the Islamic law prenup, the Texas Supreme Court said that the trial judge, not the arbitrator, has to decide if it goes to arbitration, right? That was because of a family code provision, because arbitration agreements under the family code are treated, right? So this is a great example of maybe a difference of a marital property issue being decided one way if the people are alive and getting a divorce, and a different way if someone or both of them are dead and it's being litigated in the probate process. So because especially if you talk about high net worth divorce with sort of gray divorce and people getting married later in life, sometimes divorce is estate planning by other means. And that's the same for prenuptial agreements, because you have blended families and someone's like, I want my children, whether they're a widow or they just want to protect the children from the first marriage, right? And then the flip side of that, let's say you don't have that, right? And I've seen this happen in situations where the folks are successful, or at least there's one spouse that had a lot of financial success early on. And so, but you have young children, private school tuition, stuff like that. How do you protect that? And how does how does the soon-to-be ex-wife protect her kids, right? And, you know, typical, you know, I hate to have stereotypes, but, you know, you have the stepmom that comes in and manipulates things to where it, you know, the estate goes to, you know, their children or what have you, right? I mean, there are a couple of different ways that can play out. And so there are a couple of different strategies in terms of life insurance, and some other things that I've had to do in the past that are unique to high net worth divorce. And by that, I mean high income, but not necessarily, you're not just dealing with assets, you're dealing with income streams because an income stream that, quite frankly, it's stuff that the family court's not necessarily inclined to do at trial, right? And that's the great thing about settlement, is that settlement for the right folks can afford an opportunity to be very creative and, frankly, a lot more amicable in a way that wouldn't happen at trial.
Yeah, because I think, like say, the more assets you have to deal with, so likely the judges aren't going to want to deal with that, right? They're not going to want to be able going through wasting all the time when you guys could go back to mediation, or you guys go back and settle this, right? Or probably how they're going to recommend you guys. Is that you're seeing it or
I mean,
no?
yeah, sometimes that happens. I mean, you have beyond first world problems, you know, the court's not going to want to get bogged down in what a watch collection is worth, or whether or not, you know, the kids go on some exotic vacation and the other person thinks that that country or circumstances are unsafe, right? And so, you know, sometimes what I suggest to people is like, let's just arbitrate this, right? Or let's just get a private judge, right? I mean, private judging is something that the court has to sign on to, but that's where you get a retired judge who serves as a judge, right? So you lose your right to a jury trial, but you have all the power of contempt. If you issue subpoenas, you can make someone show up, whereas an arbitrator, they can't make people adhere to subpoenas. You're still having to confirm the arbitration award, which, depending upon the situation, can present issues from an enforcement perspective. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So and a lot of times you just want privacy, right? And you don't want to be at the risk of being bumped by, you know, a busy court system. You want the freedom to have hearings after hours or on the weekends, right? Because sometimes lawyers are busy and certain lawyers are extremely busy. And so it's hard to compel attendance at something, if that makes sense, Scotty.
Yeah. And I think when just like if you go to a fancy restaurant, you have the ability to get the private room in the back if you're willing to pay the money, right? So same thing, you can kind of get this private arbitration or get this another retired judge that can kind of step in and act in that role for you, a personal thing versus just you're just another cog in the wheel thing, because you have that maybe the money to kind of spend in this situation, so you can deal with this more properly and see fit than just having to deal
Well,
with.
I hesitate to say more properly, but there's a decent chance you'll get heard more quickly, right? Or you'll just, I mean, look, it's a fact of matter. I mean, we have some very talented family judges here in Houston, but the courthouse is never going to be open on the weekend, right? Judge is never going to hear a 30-minute motion to compel hearing at 7:30 at night, right?
Yeah, I think me and Amber have been in court before representing a client, and from a real estate perspective, and we've been in court. I've been in court from like eviction status stuff, and I've been back to mediation, and so it's like it's always stressful, and it's all those things, like you're given a time and you're expected to show up, and all those things, like you're always limited on, and if you can't make it work because you're a busy person or because you have a business to run, like it makes it a lot more difficult to squeeze in your slotted time, right? They're not, you got to show up, you got to be ready. You can't be like, oh, well, I'm going to need to push this because I got another meeting or I'm out of the country or something like that. Like you're expected to be there, right? So the idea that like just getting that flexibility in the time is some of the probably most important things. Seeking people hiding things, and obviously, if you don't have a prenup, if you've been in a marriage and maybe you don't know about everything, but one of the spouses is hiding issues, and so you're going to try to figure that out. Like how do you determine if you have this, you have this business or you have these other things you don't even know, you're the spouse that's kind of not in the loop as far as the money goes. Do you recommend in those situations where we need to hire somebody? Is that kind of one of those things, or we just go, or what's the take on that? What do you do in those situations?
Right. So from a valuation standpoint, if you're valuing a business, it's almost always the case. The best practices is to have an expert. Um, if you are doing any kind of tracing analysis, almost, I mean, I've tried cases where I had to have the client do their own tracing work, and it worked out great. But if you can have the opportunity to have an expert, that's going to help you out at trial. It's going to help you settle the case, right? Sometimes the experts can, often enough the experts talk. To a certain extent, family law is kind of it's its own little world, and you have a lot of the same people that you encounter from case to case, or you have the same experts. And for people who trust one another, right, that can be, you can kind of cut through a lot of noise, right? Some people just aren't trusted, and sometimes that makes things harder to settle sometimes.
Yeah, how much they're bringing forth and letting you know, and looking at like, and I think we talked about before, you just said, hey, looking at the tax returns or how the business evaluations and K1s, and like what information do we have to base this information off so that we know if it's, so each case will be individualized, obviously, and everyone is a little bit different. I was just more looking for like, obviously you say, hey, in this case, we're going to retain a business evaluator because this business, it's too complex to really, it's not something we know openly traded or like that. So we know the value of it.
Right. And it's common enough in the contracts that people sign with their lawyers that the lawyers say, look, I don't value things, right? And in fact, if you go to trial, the lawyer can't offer testimony as to the value, right? Maybe the client can. Um, but then the real question is, does the client want to be in that position? Or even if the client is capable of testifying as to value, right? Do you want your client to be in that position, right? These are all, and this is classic lawyer answer. This is where it depends, right? But
Mm-hmm.
these are all things that have to be considered, and become especially relevant in high net worth and ultra high net worth divorce.
Yeah. And so on the financial side is that, but what about the emotional side of that? Does that have, because I know you are very high emotional intelligence as well too, and that's one thing we appreciate about you. So there's an emotional side of this, and maybe there's the public side of this as well too, because of maybe these individuals, and so the idea, or that they're not well known, but certain societies know about them, or certain people do know about them, and they know, oh, this divorce is happening. So does that play into the impact of the divorce and how it gets settled differently than say maybe a regular divorce? So like, how does that play differently to the idea of the emotional side and the publicity side of the divorce?
Well, so from an emotional side, I mean, there's almost a cliche amongst the family bar that money's a multiplier, right? And there's a lot to be said for that. And there's a lot to be said for the notion that the skills that our society reward don't always necessarily make for the most amicable of divorces, right? I mean, someone is just a hard charging businessman who's going to throw, businesswoman who's going to throw some elbows, right? That's going to make things harder. To the extent that you have people whose behavior is unregulated or loosely regulated by work or having to work, right? I mean, because a lot of times my richest clients remind me more of my pro bono clients, right, than my middle class and upper middle class clients, right? Because upper middle class, I mean, a lot of times they want to get on with their lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they want to be very practical. Um, because, but once you don't have that gravitational pull of limits, right? And spending, X amount of dollars on a lawyer it's just not going to, it's
Move
just
the
not going to
needle.
hurt right? Sometimes that results in some unfortunate situations. And and sometimes, people have a hard time believing that this is all there is, right? Because either people, there's meaningful sums there, but people have lived, if not beyond their limits, they're not the millionaire next door type, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that notion, right?
Yeah. And I think, I think that's a common theme we see around people too, like ourselves, like me being on the mortgage side. Like I see a lot of people that have wealthy homes, and it's like, well, you don't really have that much savings, right? Like there's money in the home, right? And that equity's maybe building each year, and real estate's a tool, and you got some business, but you got some cash flow off that business, but there's not always like this like huge pile of money just sitting there, right? Like just to be able to tap. Like, oh, I'm just gonna take half of this, right?
Right. I mean, look, anytime someone has an estate that has liquidity issues, right? So you're just invested in, say, a lot of real estate partnerships, right? And you are reinvesting into the business. You're just not taking the money out, right? Well, I mean, occasionally people want to be in business with their ex-spouse, but it generally is like you do not want to be in business with your ex-spouse, right? And
Yeah.
so it presents a real challenge for the person who is going to be getting the business post-divorce, right? Because they're having to make the other person liquid, right? And that can be a challenge on any number of levels, right? Emotionally, financially, I mean, because the business could be great. And then 3 years later, the business has failed. And you still have an obligation to make payments on a promissory note, right?
Mm-hmm.
You throw into the mix things like personal guarantees or insurance policies sometimes. Sometimes people, you're gonna say to the tax authorities, well, I only have X dollars, right? But you're dealing with your lender or prospective lender, and you're like, I have $2. Why don't you give me this loan, right? You gotta kind of
Yeah,
sort
we
of
see that a lot.
reconcile those two, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, from a IRS perspective, I don't make any money, but from lender perspective, I make lots of money.
yeah,
It's like, yeah, it both
right,
ways. We
right,
want those tax returns too.
right. And then, and sometimes people will have issues with this notion called personal goodwill. So if you have the business owner, and the business owner, it's like a doctor or a lawyer or a dentist, right? And they're sort of the main person, and everyone wants to hire them, right? Well, you're going to have potentially a very large discount for personal goodwill, right? Because that's separate property effectively. On the other hand, um, let's say you have a one-person law firm, but there are lots of lawyers that work for that person, right? So it's more of an enterprise, right? And those lawyers that work for that one person, they may not necessarily have an ownership interest in the firm, but they themselves bring in their own cases, right? So you have to worry about the personal goodwill of other employees, right? And then that becomes a more nuanced question, because on one hand, it's an enterprise, right? Because it's the wealth and value are being created by the work of others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it becomes a question of, well, and you don't see it happen often, right? But it does come up, right? And for the right sort of, certainly, law firm, I can, that says that hires a lot of, like, 10, 15-year lawyers, right? They don't hire baby lawyers. They hire people who have their own referral sources that are generating their own business. They don't own an interest in the firm, but it's tied up in their compensation structure. That's something to be aware of. Please.
No, I say that happens in a lot of different. I mean, not just the lawyers. That happen. Real estate firms are kind of done the same way too. Like like our brokerage. Also, like if they leave, that doesn't mean the brokerage is going to always have that money, or the lawyers can always bring that money over. So a lot of that stuff can like there's an ebb and flow I can see in all businesses. Like maybe something that was popular, maybe because of Trump comes in and tariffs change, that's going to affect that business too. You never know what could affect a business in the future, which is really hard to evaluate businesses, I think, that way. And so like that's where that it can get really, really muddy. And I think that's everything's gonna be different.
Right. And so sometimes people try to square that circle by doing something called if, as, and when, right? So we will split this if, as, and when. So like say someone has a limited partnership interest in a partnership that owns commercial real estate, right? And they're waiting to sell 5 to 10 years after the divorce is going to be finalized, but they want to be able to rely upon the distributions made of net operating income, and they think it's really going to be in the appreciation, right? So sometimes people do that, and often enough, when people are at mediation and it's 8 o'clock at night and they're frustrated and they're trying to figure out a compromise on values and they just can't get there, people will say, let's just do an if, as, and when, right? And I mean, that happens. Just like it happens that sometimes the spouse is they are both on the LLC, let's say, right? And one person's like, especially if it's like an asset holding structure, right? And I did a presentation about 5 years ago about this, but or I guess it was 6. But you can avail yourselves of some remedies in Texas corporate law, right, under the Business and Organizations Code, and ask for a windup, because all you have to show is that it's not economically practicable to stay in business for the other person. And there's only, I just did a presentation last week for the business law section of the State Bar of Texas, but one of the cases I discussed, it was a husband and wife, and they had a personal injury law firm together in Austin. And they used their divorce, they used the provision of the Texas Business and Organizations Code because their case went to trial, right? It didn't settle. And the judge had to rely upon the Business and Organizations Code to resolve their respective corporate rights in the law firm.
That's that's interesting there. And once again, Mike, like this is where the stuff that you bring, that like me being where I'm in my world, like so much more and have so much more involvement in this day-to-day stuff, helping people walk through the actual divorce part than we do. Like we deal with a lot of things, but then a lot of times we're like, hey, we got to get you to the attorney over here because it's just too complicated of a mess, right? And so that's why we do believe in having like a team of people to help you, especially if you are a high net worth individual, like going through divorce. Like you need to build a team of people around you. Like if you have your therapist, you have your attorney, you have your CDFA, right? You have your, evaluators for your business, your loan officers, or whatever this for getting the loans. Maybe you're pulling stuff in from, your tax advisors and everything like that. So definitely build that team of people around you. Mike here is in the Houston area. We've known Mike for years, and we can vouch for how great a job he does in dealing with these cases. So I'll ask you, Mike, is there any other big takeaways on like the high net worth cases that you would see, that like any other little nugget of knowledge that you would say like are tips of advice for the viewer?
Well, aside from the sort of legal nitty gritty, I'd just say be nice about everything but the money. That's what I tell all my clients.
Yeah.
And also people can have intellectually honest disagreements, right? I mean, that happens. And the thing about marital property law in Texas is that sometimes it's a little bit all over the place, right? I mean, people have kind of developed these rules of thumb, but I'll give a great example. There's been a pretty substantial academic debate about deferred compensation, right? And about, well, what if I'm working and then I get a divorce and then I get the bonus, and the bonus is discretionary. The employer doesn't have to give it to me, right? And we get divorced in December and I get my bonus in February for the prior year. And it's like, all that bonus is mine. That's my separate property. Well, there was a Dallas case that said that, and the Court of Appeals said this is bonus is separate property, even though the divorce was granted in December, right? And on December 31st of 2024, the Texas Supreme Court released a unanimous opinion reversing the Dallas Court of Appeals, and saying, nope, the bonus is community property because the labor that and effort that is being rewarded took place during the marriage. That's it's inevitable that that's going to generate litigation down the road. But I thought it was really interesting that the Texas Supreme Court on New Year's Eve had a unanimous opinion. And not only did it speak to deferred compensation, but it also spoke to when spouses signed deeds between one another and reversed a Houston decision that had been the subject of a lot of academic debate. And the ability to go beyond the four corners of the document of the deed in certain conditions, right? Which normally in real estate, you don't. You're supposed to at least try to go by what's written. And so it's just, there's no separate property lobby or community property lobby that's driving an appellate agenda, right? And the lawyers themselves, sometimes they're going to be advocating for separate property. Sometimes they're going to be advocating for community property, right? It's not like personal injury where everyone's always a plaintiff's lawyer or they're working for an insurance defense firm, right? So it's just things are in a perpetual state of murkiness sometimes, it seems.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, I see where the court would rule that way, that they would say, well, you did work, you were married, so you did earn that income while you were married. So I could see why they would be like, well, it is, even though you didn't get paid out until you were still married. I could see that being, if it was like much like the next year or 5 years, though, maybe if it was differently, but such short a time, I'd be like, yeah, that was definitely earned that while we were married, right? I mean, I could see that. That's it. So.
And this is discretionary bonuses, right? This is not restricted shares or share appreciation rights. I mean, those are kind of governed by a different provision of the family code.
This is stuff that you earn. This is earned,
right.
And you were going to get it, right? So we knew.
Right. But once bonuses are paid out over time, to your point, Scotty, right, where it is a couple of years down the road, and for some states, it's going to be relatively straightforward. It's going to be if, as, and when, right? But for other states, where maybe you have the paid off house and then people don't really have anything else. And it's like, well, I'm going to get 100% of this, well, what about, 2 years down the road, right? It just all depends. And that just goes to show that when people are interviewing lawyers or interviewing experts, you just want to make sure that it's somebody that keeps up with the case law, because things do change.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. It made me think about a case that we had where later stage, gray divorce, I guess you would say, and when the wife wanted to keep the house, she had put a lot of money from her retirement into the house to fix it up, and so she was like, if I go to live somewhere else, it's going to cost me more money than to stay here. And so what we actually ended up doing was kind of unique. We actually ended up doing a reverse mortgage buyout of that, because she didn't have any, she was retired, right? So she didn't have any income coming in, but she had the asset. And so what we were able to do was use the reverse mortgage. Usually you can only take a certain portion of it, but part of the divorce aspect, you were able to tap more of the equity up front as one payment versus usually got to spread it out. And so he was able to get paid out his portion of the equity of the house, and she was able to stay in the home and still afford it because she didn't have a payment, right? Because with the reverse mortgage, you're essentially eating into the equity each month by the mortgage is going the other way versus going down, is going up a little bit. But I think it accomplished her goals in staying in the home. She can always sell the home later and pay off that mortgage if she wants and move. But the idea is she could stay there forever, like as long as she lives there as her primary residence. So she could stay there, and as long as she pays the taxes and insurance, which is much more, with her being over 65, her taxes were fixed. And so it's really just a matter of paying insurance might keep going up, but kind of fixed her net cost, right? Which was useful in her situation as far as the gray divorce. But I just maybe think about that when you were talking about, kind of like the house being paid off, right? Because one of the things that we deal with a lot is that house stuff. And we've seen, we've dealt with a lot of clients where, the houses are high net worth, but there's not always enough money to buy out the other spouse necessarily too. So it comes into play. Like, how do we pay out the spouse? And so we usually got to re-leverage the house back to give them some of the equity if we can't get out of the business or we can't divide some of these assets. So that was always what kind of obviously that's the only tool I can do, but obviously other people have other options. And so it's like, you want to have that team of people and say like, what is the best option for us with the attorneys and the advisors and everyone else? Like, what can we do to be able to, like say, square this circle off? So
Right,
yeah,
right.
no,
Yeah, especially if someone bought their house, say 20 years ago, where it's greatly appreciated. And maybe it was a marriage later in life where they had monies gifted to them. That's kind of beyond the scope of this discussion, but it is a very nuanced issue that has just been hanging around the Texas legal system for literally centuries. Like literally, it was a probate dispute about some slaves between the kids from the first marriage and the second wife, and some
wow.
of the issues. Yeah, Love versus Robertson is the name of the case, and so you have this one body of law that predates the inception of title rule and predates earnest money contracts and the sort of, because earnest money contracts in real estate, they're used all the time, right? And so how do you deal with that? And there are a lot of interesting issues.
Yeah. Well, we won't keep you too much more, Mike, here on this, but I appreciate so much for joining us today. If you do like this video, check out the other videos we have with Mike. We have at least 4 or 5 of them out there roaming around, so I'll link to a few of them below. And if in seeking any advice, I check out the other videos we had with Mike, because I think there's a lot of great information that he's just an expert with a lot of great information to share. So we are always trying to bring experts on our channel to help if you are going through a divorce or just real estate related issues. This is kind of what our specialty is. So as always, we're here to bring you real life experience to all your real estate needs. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Scotty. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it.